Hello and welcome to episode 188 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm good, Andy. It feels like a while since we spoke because we recorded the previous podcast at the beginning of the week and this one at the end. So it almost feels like I haven't spoken to you for 2 weeks. So yeah, a lot's been going on. Been to the beach, all sorts of things. I've had in and out of the office doing some exciting new projects on Money to the Masses, which I will tell people about by the end of the year. In fact, they'll be launched by the end of the year. So there's something I'm really excited about. As excited as I was about 80/20 Investor being launched. So that shows you how good I think it's going to be. So yeah, we've had lots to do. Where are you, Andy? Because I feel like I'm talking to a roving reporter because I heard seagulls in the background earlier on. So I think we're going to have a nice backdrop to this podcast.
I'll try and cut out as much as I can in the edit, but yes, indeed, you did hear seagulls. I'm currently in a hotel room on the south coast of England, somewhere in the midst of West Sussex, for reasons which I won't bore you with right now. But yeah, I'm out on the road, and that's the beauty of these podcasts. We've done them in cars before, we've done them where you've been away, I've been away, but we always seem to come together and find a place where we can chat and talk about money. So yeah, no, it's nice. We're giving you the seagulls in the background to remind you of your recent trips to the beach.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
What have we got on this week's pod?
On this week's podcast, Andy, we've got the usual three pieces. In fact, one of them picked up on something I mentioned at the end of the last podcast. Do you remember I talked about interest rate rises and the potential for rates to go up? And of course they did. Unless you've been under a rock, you probably heard that the Bank of England put up the base rate from 0.5% to 0.75%. So I'm going to do a whole piece around that because I'm going to talk about what it means for savers, what it means for mortgage borrowers, what you need to do, and where are rates going in the future, because the direction of travel certainly looks upwards. I'm also going to talk about something to do with investing, and in particular the rising risks that are appearing in your portfolios, and you may not realise, but at the low end, the low risk end of your portfolio. So I'm talking particularly property funds. So that's something you won't want to miss because it's not been widely reported. And the energy supplier woes that are out there. There's been an energy supplier go bust recently, and plenty of listeners out there will probably have been customers. In fact, my own brother was a customer, and I'm going to talk about what it means when your energy provider goes bust, what actually happens, what you should do, and should you try and avoid some of the smaller companies that have the potential to go bust.
Brilliant. Shall we start with what is the elephant in the room, I suppose, what everyone has been talking about and what we just missed at the end of last podcast, and let's talk about this rate rise. So what does it mean for people, and a bit more of an insight into it, I suppose.
Yeah, at the end of the last podcast, I mentioned to keep an eye out for the possibility of a rate rise. Now, the market had pretty much baked it in. They'd given it about a 95% chance of happening, and rates did go in. It was a unanimous decision. If you remember, the Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC, who are at the Bank of England, all sit down and make a decision, and there's 9 of them that make the decision. And it's a majority vote. But actually, everybody voted for a rate rise.
Was it 100%?
Yeah, it was a unanimous decision. So 9-0. And we had the splits in the past where we've had rate rises and things like that, or cuts. But this one was unanimous. So the direction of travel for rates is certainly upwards. Now, I'll come on to in a minute where how many interest rates we can expect in the near future and where rates are going to go. But the interesting thing about the rate rise was that when you are a customer, how does it impact you as a consumer? So when you've got a bank, did they raise rates on their mortgages, and what do they do with savings rates? So I'm going to give you a quiz, Andy. Okay, so how many banks do you think have already, banks and building societies have already passed on the interest rate rise to consumers? Because obviously if you've got a fixed rate mortgage, your mortgage isn't going to change. But if you've on your standard variable rate, which the majority of people are, then the bank can vary their mortgage rate in line with the Bank of England base rate. And if you're a tracker, then it definitely will be moving in line with the bank base rate. So how many mortgages do you reckon in terms of percentage wise?
In terms of percentage, I would say they're going to be pretty hot on it, because at the end of the day, this is how they make money. So I'm going to say 80%.
Well, it will be 80%. At the moment, I mean, it's only just happened, so it's days old, so it's about 30% have already done it. Now, I mean, HSBC and Barclays pretty much did it straight away and passed on the full rate hike, and Lloyds are doing it on the 1st of September. What you can guarantee is it will pretty much be unanimous in the end. They're not going to absorb it. So banks make their money by that differential between what they lend and what they actually pass on to savers. So let me give you another one, Andy. How many out of 100 banks and building societies do you think have fully passed on that 0.25%, that measly 0.25% extra onto savers?
I would say relatively few, but let's go for the purposes of this podcast and to not make it sound silly. I'm going to go for 30%.
Yeah, it's a good guess actually, Andy. No, it wasn't. It was 1. So 1 out of 100 banks, and this is where the uproar has come, because banks and building societies are very quick to pass on the rate rise to their mortgage borrowers, but savers are being left behind, and they're basically profiteering. There's no other way of putting it. They're not raising their savings rates because they want to increase their profit margins. And that is why, if you remember in the past when I've done podcast episodes where I've talked about how you invest in a rising interest rate environment, and that's why financials like banks are often good places to invest money. I'm talking about when you buy funds or shares, they tend to do quite well in this kind of environment, and it's a brilliant demonstration of what I was talking about. So they will make more money from the people they lend to by charging them higher interest rates, so they're mortgage borrowers, but they won't raise rates on savings accounts. So going forward, you can only hope that some of them will start to pass them on. MPs are putting pressure on the industry, but the industry doesn't tend to listen to MPs all that much unless it's forced to. So the impact for savers is minimal. They're basically going to get nothing anyway. They're getting next to nothing now. You're going to get next to nothing still going forwards. For mortgage borrowers, if you've got 100 grand on a repayment mortgage and you've got about 25 years to go, using a standard variable rate of about 4%, which is quite high, but that's a kind of where you might end up if you aren't on a low rate, then it's going to make about £14.13 for every £100,000 you borrow. So if you it's not going to be it's going to be noticeable, but it's only sort of a marginal increase. But the direction of travel is certainly upwards. Now, what do you do if you are a mortgage borrower? It's a good sign to think about fixing your mortgage rate if you are sensitive to your mortgage going up. The way to do that is obviously to go and talk to a mortgage broker. You can shop around yourself. I personally think you're better off going to speak to a mortgage broker, as do about 70% of people who take out mortgages, and that is because they can save you a lot of pain and a lot of effort, because they can tell you who will lend to you based on your circumstances, your deposit, your credit history, and they'll save you a lot of heartache, I suppose is the word, because you could apply for a mortgage and be rejected, and then that's going to have a future impact on any other mortgages possibly that you may apply for. So I'm always an advocate of going to speak to a mortgage broker.
I agree. A good mortgage advisor will save you time, money and stress. And at the end of the day, when you're going through what is one of life's probably most stressful things that you'll go through, if you've got someone who's got your back and has got the knowledge, then why wouldn't you use them? I absolutely agree with that.
And the thing is, you don't realise the amount of admin and paperwork that's going to happen when you go through a remortgage, and a mortgage broker can hide you from some of that or protect you from some of that. But of course, I mean, I always go for an independent, because there is always, like we talked about last week, estate agents and people like that will try and use tied broker, or encourage you to use tied brokers. Use an independent because they can really shop around. Now, I was asked by the Times newspaper this week, if you read the Times, then you'll probably have seen me in there, about what savers can do about the lack of the interest rate being passed on. Well, banks rely on inertia. Customer inertia is how they make their money. The fact that you don't switch accounts when you're talking about your current account makes them money. The fact that even when they basically give you a kick in the teeth, you come back for more, is how they make their money. So if you are in an easy access account, an easy access savings account, then you are free to go and move your savings as you want now. Obviously, people who've tied their money up in fixed rate savings bonds are not going to be able to just move around as a result of this rate hike and the lack of it being passed on, because they'll be penalised. But if you're in an easy access account, then you can. So the message is shop around. So go and look at the best buy tables that are out there. Lots of places, including moneytothemasses.com. We have best savings tables that aren't based upon who gives the best deal to the comparison sites. A lot of comparison sites promote savings accounts and things that give them a good kickback. Our tables are just impartial, provided by a third party, where they aren't based upon any kickback. So have a look at those. Just to give you an idea, you can get about 2.15% on a 1 year fixed rate savings bond if you want to shop around and lock your money away. Easy access is much less than that. The real answer potentially for people is to consider high interest savings accounts and their current accounts. And they can pay between 3 and 5% on certain amounts, certain balances. They normally limit the balance up to, say, £3,000 or £5,000, which for a lot of people is enough. Now, they often have caveats about the amount of money you have to pay in each month, or the amount of direct debits you have coming in and out. So you're meant to try and use it as a current account. Now, you can get around these things by just moving money from one account to another in a sort of virtuous circle where you can hit all those criteria and just leave a balance in each of the different accounts, because you can hold multiple of these current accounts with different providers. So Tesco do one for 3%. Interestingly, if you are ridiculously loyal to your bank, even if they're not passing on the full interest rate hike, so Nationwide and TSB are examples of this, they have very, very competitive high interest rate current accounts. And they pay 5% on their balances, so you may want to look at those. And I don't think there are any caveats. I've looked tirelessly through their T's and C's for caveats saying that existing customers can't use them, but it doesn't say, I couldn't find anything as such. So if you don't want to move banks, look at what other accounts your banks have, because they may have a high interest savings account, a current account that you may be able to use. But I mean, don't be loyal to your bank. I mean, they don't care about you. There's no nicer way, or sort of, what's the nicer way, diplomatic way perhaps of putting it. They don't care about you, so you may as well shop around. So the other thing I would point out, that if you are going to do that, then do make sure that the bank or building society that you go to or switch to is covered by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, so if they go bust, you get your money back. And also keep track of any introductory offers, because of course all the best buy tables will have or tend to have introductory offers. So by that I mean they'll go, you get a certain juicy rate for a year, and then it drops down to 2/5 of nothing again. And so what you would need to do is set a diary note that you will move again in a year. It's just like energy deals. You need to keep moving around to get the best rate, and that's just unfortunately the way it works in this industry. Once upon a time there was an account that was run by one company that just took the average of the top savings accounts out there. It was brilliant. But of course, like all brilliant things, they withdrew it in the end because it was obviously making enough money. So the other thing I would say is that, of course, keep thinking about moving your accounts around or keeping tabs on the market can be an absolute headache. And savingschampion.co.uk, that's savingschampion.co.uk, do a service called Rate Tracker. And if you go on their site, you just put in your email address, what accounts you're in, and they monitor if there are better deals out there, and will alert you when it's a good time when there's a better deal and when it's a good time to consider switching savings accounts. So it's a neat tool, it's free to use, but it could end up helping you to beat this profiteering of the banking industry. Oh, I wrapped that up there, didn't I? I kind of, the intonation in my voice was almost as if I'd finished, but actually I promised to talk about when rates will, the direction of rates. Very quickly, there are predicted to be another 2 interest rate rises by 2020. So that means in the next sort of 18 months. Whether there'll be another one this year, the market isn't predicting there will. The market isn't often great at predicting it into the sort of medium-term future. When it's about to happen, as in tomorrow, they are quite good at predicting it, as we showed last month. Generally speaking, by 2021, they think interest rates will be at 1.25%. So you can get a steer for what will happen to your mortgage if you're not on a fixed rate. Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 Investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insights, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries, and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers in the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service. Let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show.
Okay, so moving on to our investing piece this week, the dangers of what's lurking in your portfolio. Damien, tell us more.
Right, this came from my me reviewing my £50,000 portfolio I run live on 80/20 Investor. And yeah, I know you probably just heard an advert for the service, but what I do is every month I review the portfolio, and at the moment it's in record profit, which is nice to see. It's up, I think, 32.2% since March 2015, which is around, that's 3.5 years, or 3 and a bit years, so which is a fantastic result, and it's outperforming trackers, active managers, and I think generally speaking, if you look at equivalent managed funds with the same sort of portfolio setup, it's outperforming 80 to 90% of those. So which, if you think when you start, I have no idea where the market's going, it's just using the process, then by doing so, be able to achieve that is been fantastic. So I'm really pleased with it. But when I'm every month I sit down and look at the portfolio, and I look at what the 80/20 Investor data shows and what's going on in the market, and I change it. And one of the things I did this month, there was quite a few changes, which is unusual. I try to keep things fairly fluid. So I rather than I'm pruning. Do you remember I often use gardening analogies for someone who's really poor at gardening? I don't know why I use so many gardening analogies, but it does seem to help explain things. But what I do is I tend to prune. I don't dig things up and chuck them away. I tend to just prune to try and let things grow. And I don't therefore like to do wholesale changes of like a number of funds. At the moment I did hold about 12 sort of funds in the portfolio, which is quite high for me. Normally it's sort of 10 or under. And some people might think 12, only 12, that sounds quite low. But I tend to like to be a bit focused. Anyway, looking at the portfolio, one of the things that's been troubling me of late is the low risk end. I keep a balanced portfolio. Now, you can do what you like with 80/20. You can take a higher risk angle if you want. And I had a fantastic email this week from somebody who had actually stopped using 80/20 Investor. They've been using it for 2 years, loved it. Unfortunately, been made redundant, and they wanted to strip back on costs. And even though they admitted that 80/20 isn't that expensive, it taught them everything they really wanted to do and how confident they were now to go forward, which was music to my ears, because that might sound odd, Andy, but the whole point of what I wanted to do was to empower and teach people to be able to go and do their own thing. The fact that most people will obviously keep using the 80/20 Investor is good, but it's that whole thing. If you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. And that's what I'm doing. So for some people, their journey carries on without me, which is great. And he outperformed my portfolio because he took more risk. And that's the whole thing I love about it, is that people in the city often tell you, I'm a genius, give me your money, I'll outperform everybody. Well, what I'm trying to do is teach you how you can do it yourself and outperform people. But one of the things I'm looking at the portfolio is that I have this low end of my portfolio to keep it balanced. And one of the things I've noticed is that obviously bonds have been a dire place to be in 2018. You're not getting anything for your money. And it raises the sort of question of whether you should actually invest in bonds as opposed to cash. Because one of the things this is just a bit of a rhetorical question for people to think about, really, that when you're investing money, cash is actually a destination in itself. People always think of it as a starting point, and you've got to go somewhere else. Cash can be a destination and should be occasionally, and especially when markets are getting a bit sort of wobbly and downturns, and because you won't lose money. And the thing is, when you're moving away from cash, you're starting to take investment risk, which may be into bonds and other low-risk assets like property. You've got to think whether the risk-return reward metric. So for the risk you're taking, are you getting additional reward? The risk is going to mean you could lose some money. Is it worth it? At the moment, bonds is debatable whether it is. So it's something for people to bear in mind. If the market goes south, I'm talking about equity markets, bond markets should do better. But this year, bond markets have been very, very lackluster. So it's something to bear in mind if you're looking at your portfolio. Is it worth investing in bonds at the moment? So I'm keeping a bit of money in cash at the moment in my portfolio, looking for those opportunities. But the one thing I really wanted to consider at the low risk end, aside for the question over bonds, is property funds. Now, I held a property fund in my portfolio. Now, property funds are a very sort of eclectic mix. There's a sector for them, but they include funds that invest in bricks and mortar, and by that I mean properties like offices or shopping centres. You may not realise this. You may be listening to this podcast driving in a car, but if you look out your window and you're driving past a shopping centre or a retail park, there's a very good chance that a property fund that might be in your portfolio owns that. And if you look at their fund fact sheets, they actually list the addresses of them. So some of the big shopping centres around the country and offices in the city are owned by property funds. And at the other end of the spectrum in property funds, there are ones that just invest in shares of property. So they're really just equity funds, if that makes sense. They invest in companies that maybe build houses or that may be doing other forms of construction or letting out. They don't actually own the property, they own shares. So they behave like shares. So you'll get some really wild movements in the sort of best performing tables of property funds, which is why I don't like them. In terms of, I'm talking about the property best buy tables you see out there, those sort of rankings. So I look at the funds themselves, and one of the issues is Brexit. Now, if you've been listening to the news, Brexit is becoming the biggest car crash politically that we've seen in a generation. And by the day, it looks increasingly likely, or the odds are rising, I should say, of a hard Brexit, of one where there is no deal. It's not even hard in terms of like we're going to have agreed something that's going to really sort of cut ties and everything. It's going to be like we're going to hit the walls, and I don't think there's any airbags in the car to go off. And during 2016, when we had the Brexit vote and the referendum said that we wanted to leave the EU, there was a massive crunch, almost a credit crunch, as it were, or liquidity crunch, I should say, in property funds that invested in bricks and mortar. Because what happened, because the outlook for UK property therefore diminished, and they thought that lots of the investors would start pulling their money back out of the UK, then the outlook for commercial property fell, and investors started withdrawing their money at a great rate from funds that invest in property. And what this meant is that if you're a fund manager that has property, you can't sell a tenth of a building. If a tenth of your fund is liquidated, you can't sell a tenth of a building and give the people their money back. So what started to happen, there was some false selling of property they didn't want to do, but more importantly, you can't just sell a property in a day. So what happened, a lot of these funds either penalised people withdrawing their money by applying exit charges, or they just went, nah, you can't have your money, we're stopping all withdrawals. And people were trapped in their funds, couldn't get their money out as the value was falling. And it was to stop this vicious circle of people withdrawing money, false selling of property, driving down the value of the fund, meaning that more people would sell the fund. So they had to stop it. But of course, as an investor, that means your money's stuck and you couldn't get it out. It took around about 6 to 8 months for most of the funds to take off those sort of caps and penalties and closures of the fund. Now, in the lead up to that vote, so we're talking about April and May of 2016, investors took, this is according to the FT, because I was researching it yesterday, 148 million from property funds in April 2016, 367 million during May, and then in June that accelerated massively because of the Brexit vote. There was a panic, and around 6% of all assets across the property fund sector were withdrawn, and this therefore caused this panic and the fund managers to close their funds and stop you getting your money out. Now, fast forward to today, and I'm watching the news, and I'm starting to get a bit concerned about the holding that I had in one of these funds that is invested in bricks and mortar. And the reason I've held it in recent months, it's been a fantastic holding because bonds have been dire, as I said, cash is doing nothing. But this was slowly ticking up, getting a steady positive return. It was diversifying the portfolio, which is great. The issue is that I'm now worried that I'll get my money stuck in there. So I can crunch numbers that look at the performance of a fund over a period of time and the size of a fund, and I'm talking about the last 3 months. And then you can work out what the underlying withdrawals or gain in terms of like net inflow from investors has been. And the figures to me are a little bit startling. So one of the funds was Standard Life Investments UK Real Estate, which I held. Now, the fund was worth 2.4 billion, and it's now fallen in value, and it reckons about just a shade under 100 million has been taken out of that fund. Now, that's in 3 months, and that equates to about 3.5% of the fund's value. Now, we were talking about 6% of assets disappearing in 2016, in June 2016, that was causing panic for the whole sector. Now, that to me is starting to sort of make me feel a little bit nervous. Now, I'm not saying Standard Life are going to close the fund, but when you're looking at warning signs, to me, a lot of the property, I've done it across all the funds, and a lot of the property funds that invest in actual properties are starting to see withdrawals. Now, Aberdeen UK Property was worth a similar amount, 2.3 million, and the analysis shows, and this is according to Trustnet's figures that I'm using, about 400 million has been taken out of that fund. Now, that's quite a chunk. That's looking at sort of, heading towards something like a fifth, or something like 15 to 20% of that fund has been taken out. Now, to me, it's just sensible. If you're starting to see things like that, Brexit is going to complete disaster, I've moved out. So the point of this piece is, I'm not telling you to sell your UK funds, property funds that invest in bricks and mortar. It's making you aware of the rising risks that are in your low risk end of your portfolio that you could, if we get nearer to Brexit, we don't resolve this, a case where your money gets stuck in a property fund, but also that the low risk end may not actually be providing any upside for the risks you're taking. I'm talking about bonds in that regard. So review the low risk end of your portfolio, be aware of the rising risks, and take action if you think it's appropriate.
Good stuff. And so the last piece is on energy companies, and we've seen one recently go bust. And interestingly, I didn't see this in the news. So obviously they can't be that big a company, or something's gone on here. You say your brother was affected. What have we got, and what can people do, Damien?
Right, I'm going to call this bit the energy supplier woes. And one of the things is we shop around. I've been talking in this podcast about shopping around on savings rate. Inertia is the thing that will mean you pay through the teeth over the odds for things in life. And energy companies are just like banks. They rely on inertia. So you get a great deal, you stay with them, that great deal ends, and then you end up on a really expensive variable tariff. Now, when we shop around, in 2004, there were only 13 suppliers out there. So they were talking about energy suppliers. So there wasn't much choice. And given that we have like the big six, I think it is in energy, like a bit like the Safari, the big six, we have a similar thing in energy companies, but it's far less exciting and interesting. It's just the big boys take the lion's share of the market. I didn't mean that pun then, but anyway.
It was good.
It was good, wasn't it? Today, we have an amazing 69 energy suppliers out there, and that's because Ofgem, who are the regulators, relaxed the rules about who could become an energy supplier, how it works. So with 69 of them, so you've got this amazing choice. And of course, as you suggested, Andy, there are a lot of suppliers you've never heard of. And so if you go onto the comparison sites and you sit there and think, like, I'm going to go for a deal, you'll think, I've never heard these guys, but it's a brilliant deal, I'm going for it. Fair enough, there's nothing wrong with that. But, as my brother has just found out, that his energy supply has gone bust, and they were called ERISA. I think that's how you say it, IRESA, because I've never heard of them either. And they went bust just recently, in the last month or so. And they aren't the first energy supplier to go bust. It is unusual. There was one in January. Future Energy went bust in January. And so Justin, my brother, said to me, so what the hell happens now then with my energy? And I said, well, you're going to still get your gas. And that's the point. What does actually happen? So I'm just going to quickly run through it for people. If your energy provider goes bust, then Ofgem have a safety net. The regulator has a safety net that ensures that you will still have an energy supplier. So it's not like you can stop paying your direct debit and think, oh, they've gone bust, I'm going to still get my gas. The first thing is you do get your gas and energy and electricity. That will carry on as you realise that the energy company that you are with don't actually supply the gas and electricity that comes down your lines. It's still there. It's still going on. They're the people who charge you for it. So you'll still get your supply. That's okay. Ofgem, what they do is they go out there and say, look, this company's collapsed. They go out and allow other companies to bid for those customers. And the idea is the process is meant to ensure that you get the best deal. Now, I don't think it's going to mean you're going to get the best deals in the cheapest rate in the market, but what they'll do is when you've got people competitively competing for your custom, then they will go for the person that's going to give you the best deal. So what happens is you sit tight, and Ofgem tell you to sit tight, keep paying your direct debits, don't switch, just wait for the dust to settle, and they will do it as quickly as possible, find you an energy supplier, tell you who it is. In the case of the Irissa Energy, it's actually now Octopus who've taken them over. And once you get your energy supplier, that new energy supplier will get in touch. Your direct debits will continue to be taken by them. And at that point, you can say to them, put me on a better deal, or you can therefore switch and shop around.
I think that's interesting because as a new company coming in as well, they've got a vested interest in making sure that they look after their stakeholders, the people who are paying them the money. Why would they buy into a business and then frankly piss off all their brand new customers? So I think that's really good advice. Sit tight and see what happens and argue for a better deal.
Yeah, and the point is that somebody out there is, well, the regulator is watching out for you. Now, in my brother's case, he got an email telling them that this is what's happening, to sit tight. Now, the sort of slightly bad news is all this smart meter stuff. You know I'm not a fan of smart meters as they are at the moment, Andy. But if you were one of those customers and say your provider went bust and you had a smart meter, one of the current generation smart meters, then your new provider you'll go to, that probably won't work. So you've got a dumb piece of kit sitting there and you're going to go back to having to manually read your meters. Just to finish off on some tips to how you spot the dangers of this. Now, it's difficult because I suppose most people will be thinking, well, I don't really, if I'm going to pick a deal, I want that deal to be in existence. I don't want an energy supplier who's going to go bust, because if the energy supplier goes bust, then I'm probably going to end up paying more than I wanted to. Now, if they go bust, you're not going to have to pay any exit penalties, by the way, so don't worry about that. What you can do is you don't necessarily have to avoid the small companies. I mean, there is obviously, you could argue, perhaps a increased likelihood that they may go bust, but you don't have to avoid them. The Energy Ombudsman provides quarterly complaint figures for every provider, so you can have a look at them if you're thinking about switching to a new provider, to see if people are grumbling about the company, about them not fulfilling what they're supposed to do, or they're just a high level of customer complaints. That could be an indicator that something's going wrong. Equally, if you search the internet, things like Trustpilot with reviews may give you an indication. I suppose the positive to bear in mind that having a regulator is that in the case of Irissa, and people are probably shouting at this podcast, so I keep mispronouncing that name, but in the case of that provider and any other that gets into difficulty, the regulator, Ofgem, will stop them raising the direct debits of their existing customers or taking on new customers. So that, again, if the regulator's getting wind that things aren't going well with a particular particular company, I should say, then they will start taking action to try and stop more people getting sucked in. So there you go. What will happen if your energy supplier goes bust?
Good stuff. Enjoyed it this week, Damien. And if you, the listener, would like to get in touch with Damien, please make sure you contact him at Money to the Masses. That's Money to the Masses on Twitter with the number 2. Or you can contact Damien by email, damien@moneytothemasses.com. And it's Damien, Damien. And of course, if you'd like to go onto iTunes and give us a review, we would absolutely love that. It helps us fly up the charts. I haven't had a chance to check the reviews this week. Have you, Damien?
I haven't, Andy. I've been too busy, but we will do next week.
And yeah, of course, we'll read those out if you are kind enough to review us. We're kind of done, Damien, aren't we? Until next week.
Until next week, Andy.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Play. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.